Hello, this is a video on the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland is a triangular shaped organ that you can find above each kidney. It has three main layers, the capsule on the outside, the cortex, kind of on the outside as well, and the medulla, which is in the middle of the adrenal gland. The capsule predominantly serves a protective function. The cortex has three layers of itself, and the medulla is the medulla. The three layers of the cortex, the zona glomerulosa, fasciculata, and reticularis, can be remembered through the first letter of each of those words, G, F, and R, which reminds you of the glomerular filtration rate, which is another thing that is relevant to the kidneys. Uh, and the sequence of GFR helps us remember the sequence of glomerulosa on the outside, fasciculata a little bit more inside, and reticularis even more inside. Each zone produces a different hormone. So the zona glomerulosa produces mineralocorticoids, predominantly aldosterone. Fasciculata is predominantly glucocorticoids, or it is glucocorticoids, predominantly cortisol, and reticularis gonatocorticoids, predominantly androgens. You can remember these functions through a quick, another triple, which is salt, stress, and sex. For salt being aldosterone and the corresponding hormones. The medulla produces catecholamines, which are which is kind of like a group of hormones. In this case, we're talking about adrenaline and noradrenaline. Starting off with the adrenal medulla, this this stuff you don't need to know in too much detail, but it helps you to give a little bit of context to it. The medulla develops from neural crest cells, while the cortex develops from something else, right? So these two things have different cells in it of different embryonic origin. So the means of which the medulla and the cortex activate are different. The medulla is actually modified neural tissue that is actually a part of the autonomic nervous system. This makes sense now that it is activated using the sympathetic stimulation from the brain, since it can directly stimulate the adrenal medulla cells. It contains mainly of chromaffin cells, and it produces about 80% adrenaline and 20% noradrenaline at a given time. A bit more on adrenaline. So, catecholamines, the pathway of synthesis of catecholamines in general, so we're talking about adrenaline and noradrenaline, follows this nice little flowchart here. We start off with tyrosine, and through tyrosine hydroxylase, which is the first enzyme, I believe it is rate limiting. Uh, don't quote me on that though. Tyrosine, L-DOPA, dopamine, and then noradrenaline, and then adrenaline. So adrenaline is the final product. Adrenaline is produced and stored in the vesicles of chromaffin cells, and through exocytosis is then released. The mode of action of adrenaline, I hope you guys remember, is that it binds to adrenergic alpha and beta receptors. Noradrenaline is more specific for alpha receptors, but adrenaline is non-specific. And after this binding on the surface, it causes some chemical cascade through G proteins, cyclic AMPs or kinases, which we don't need to know the details of. But what we do need to know is that the final effect is a flight or fight effect, a fight or flight effect with raised heart rate, blood pressure, increased glucose levels, and everything else necessary to help the body survive. Cool. So moving on to the adrenal cortex. The three layers of the adrenal cortex have different functions predominantly because of the different enzymes in each of these zones. They all produce stuff using cholesterol, but because they have different enzymes in different proportions in these zones, they end up producing different things. So you can note that the first enzyme in this stepwise process is actually the same, but the other enzymes are all different. So the differential expression of these steroidogenic enzymes is what makes the adrenal cortex unique in this way. So let's now talk about the pathway for producing specifically cortisol. So uh, more broadly, stuff from the adrenal cortex. So now we're going to start all the way from the hypothalamus to the pituitary to the adrenal gland. And this axis is known as the HPA axis. This is a bit of a refresher on the anatomy of the hypothalamus and the pituitary. So you might remember that in the hypothalamus we have two nuclei, the supraoptic and paraventricular. Supraoptic is to do with ADH, but paraventricular is to do with everything else. And specifically within paraventricular, we're interested in parvocellular neurons. So these parvocellular neurons release factors into the median eminence, which is the blood supply, which eventually moves into the anterior pituitary and stimulates anterior pituitary cells. Okay, so before we uh, think about how the hypothalamus works, we need to think about what actually stimulates the hypothalamus for all of this stuff. There are two main factors for that. It's the circadian rhythm and stress, which then causes paracellular neurons to secrete corticotropin-releasing hormone. And this then stimulates the anterior pituitary to produce ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone. Cool. So now we have ACTH from the anterior pituitary, which then binds to receptors in the adrenal cortex, which then increases steroidogenic enzyme activity, but it is disproportionately activated. We've got aldosterone only increasing a bit, and most of it comes from the renin-angiotensin system, so the RAS system. Cortisol is activated a lot because of ACTH, and androgens are also activated a lot because of ACTH. Now, this is an axis, so there's always going to be negative feedback. The key way is cortisol feeds back into the pituitary and the hypothalamus for negative feedback, stopping both CRH and ACTH. Okay, so a bit more on cortisol specifically. We just talked about what stimulates it and I guess the steps for creating it. Let's talk about its mode of action. So this is a steroid, so it has a carrier protein in the blood for it to be carried, since it's not water soluble. However, since it is fat soluble, it can pass right through the cell membrane, so it binds to cytosolic glucocorticoid receptors. Cytosolic meaning these receptors are inside the cytoplasm of the target cell. Because it's fat soluble, so it just goes right through. And then it forms a hormone receptor complex, which then binds to DNA, which then alters gene expression. And the effect is that ultimately it prepares the body for stress. So it raises blood glucose levels because it's a glucocorticoid. And in terms of cardiovascular function, it increases adrenergic receptor expression, which promotes adrenoceptor function, which increases blood pressure and cardiac output. For immunosuppression, so it sort of moves the body's energy away from immune function and towards like this other stuff. That's the way I think about it in order to remember it. But it has immunosuppressive function, so it does all these things. And it also inhibits the reproductive function of the body. So since it has a significant anabolic cost, and we're more interested in surviving with the cortisol. And another cool thing is that the reason why it's stimulated by the circadian rhythm is because in the morning, I guess it's like a way to wake up and get ready for um, stressors at upon waking up, which is probably like evolutionary. But much like anything else, too much of cortisol is not too good for you. So there are a couple of ways through which we can have excess cortisol, either through tumors. So primary tumor, a primary cause would be an adrenal tumor. Secondary cause would be a pituitary tumor, which causes increased ACTH. Most commonly, it's just the use of exogenous corticosteroids that are prescribed. But it causes a syndrome called Cushing syndrome, and this is a classic picture, which will be embedded in your memory forever, of what we call a Cushingoid picture, with all of these different signs that may be able to observe on physical examination. The cause of all this stuff is obviously because of the function of cortisol in overdrive. Gluconeogenesis causes um, essentially uh, stuff to be taken away, or catabolism of other stuff in your body, which broadly leads to muscle weakness and skin weakness, causing easy bruising. Lipolysis to convert to glucose, but it also gets redistributed to different parts of your body, like your back over here, which causes a buffalo hump or a fat pad there. Hypoglycemia, you have bone problems, you are immunosuppressed, and you might end up with hypertension because of increased adrenal receptor expression because of cortisol. All right, you can also have too little of cortisol. The way this happens is, um, well, the disease you see this in is called Addison's disease, and the cause of Addison's disease is an autoimmune damage to the adrenal gland by large. So it's damage to all of the zones, so aldosterone would decrease as well. So we're really talking about Addison's disease here, which is broad adrenal insufficiency, not specifically for cortisol. So because of that, you will have loss of aldosterone, which leads to hypotension because of your sodium, potassium concentrations are all messed up. Loss of cortisol, which leads to hypoglycemia, weakness, fatigue, loss of weight and appetite. And now you have excess ACTH, which is going to be increased because of reduced cortisol. So you have reduced negative feedback. And now that is going to act on melanocytes to produce melanin, which will cause increased skin pigmentation. And the treatment is to take glucocorticoids and mineralocorticoids to treat the deficiency. A nice way to tie all this stuff together is through a syndrome called general adaptation syndrome. When the body undergoes a lot of stress, we use what the medulla produces, adrenaline, and we use what the cortex produces, cortisol, to help the body return to homeostasis or help the body adapt to the stressor. Now, there are three broad phases to chronic stress. Um, And the first phase is alarm reaction. So within 2 days, we see a spike of adrenaline or adrenaline uh, with reduced stress resistance because it's the first time it's happening. And through the secretion of cortisol over more than 2 days later, we have an increased resistance to the stress for the body. But over 1 to 3 months later, we enter a phase called exhaustion, where this cortisol is just not enough. And our reserves are depleted and your body starts taking a hit. So this is it in a little bit more detail. Um, the key thing is that in the exhaustion phase, your autonomic nervous system is activated again, but your glucocorticoids, your cortisol, still remains high. So your cortisol increases adrenergic action, um, and the combined effects of adrenaline increases it further, and it causes a myriad of like bad stuff you don't want to happen in your body. And that is the end of the presentation. Thanks for watching and have a great day.